Welcome to our podcast, Therapy on a Tangent. My name is Natalie, and this is my co-host, Zori.
Hi, folks.
And this is a podcast where two therapists nerd out on some geeky passions of ours and mental health. So, Zori, what have you been into lately?
So at the time of this recording, is I basically have like a week or two before a semester starts. Because again, I'm a professor teaching future counselors, and I was telling Natalie about this earlier, but I realized when I was younger, I had a lot of anxiety around back to school time, but it showed up as me like, you know, being excited about packing my school bag and then unpacking it and then packing it again. And everyone thought it was so cute. And then now looking back, I'm like, I was anxious. I had a lot of anxiety as a child. So now I don't have cool new school supplies to pack and then unpack now. So I think it's been showing up recently as watching a lot of comfort movies. So I've been watching a lot of like Disney movies, like especially Disney movies that I grew up with, and then also watching movies like The Mummy. One of those by awakening movies that we love to talk about, or at least that I love to talk about. So I've just been watching a lot of that and just thinking about like how comfort movies, like things that we've watched like a whole bunch of times, can be really relaxing and can sometimes soothe anxiety. So yeah, I've been anxious and watching movies.
That's not a bad thing. I think there's something very nice about like the predictability of like, oh, this is a movie that I know. I know what the feelings are that's coming up. So I know how to prepare for it. So I feel like that's so counter to like anxiety sometimes, where it's like it could be unpredictable. I don't really know what's going on. I'm nervous about everything. At least like a comfy movie is like I know exactly
Hmm.
what I'm walking into.
Yeah. And how Miyazaki movies, like Studio Ghibli movies, I've been watching a lot of those as well. Especially, I rotate between, though I like all of them, I rotate between Howl's Moving Castle, which is like one of my faves, Spirited Away, and Kiki's Delivery Service. Those are like my big anxiety comfort movies.
That's great. And I think those are feel good movies too. So maybe that's part of why it helps with the anxiety. It's like, oh, it has a good warm feels to it.
What about you?
Lately, me and my partner, we have been watching This Is Us, and it's it's an interesting show. So it's about a family that had three children and then lost one during delivery, and then they adopted a baby, and so the story follows like this white family with an adopted black brother, and it just goes through life. And I think there's something really nice about just watching how people have lived their lives. It does kind of like this side by side comparison of like, this is what happened in the past with these siblings growing up, and then this is kind of what they're doing now, where they're at. Um, I'm pretty sure we started watching this because I always make fun of my husband because it's like, do you have feelings? When do you cry? And I was like, this is a show that's supposed to make you cry. So we're here watching this watching this TV show, hopefully for the feels. I have definitely cried a ton during this, and I have not seen him shed a tear.
Mhm.
So we'll see. Hopefully it gets to him. But it's such a good show, and I think it's so wholesome too in a way. Just watching people's lives, I think it's very different from like watching like reality TV and things like that. So that's what I've been watching lately.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I know a show like that would make me so anxious, and I think that's why I like watching reality TV shows because it uh, like I feel like I mean there's always a scripted element of reality TV shows, especially now, but I feel like it there's never a level with reality TV shows, or at least the ones that I watch, where like I'm gonna be like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna cry. While with shows like This Is Us, I know like that's their end game. That's what they want you to do. Like if you're not crying, and I'm like, I'm too dehydrated to cry right now. Like I don't drink enough water, so I can't do that.
Well, maybe I'm trying to get in touch with the part of myself that's really sad. Maybe it's I'm just sad and I haven't had an outlet to cry, and this is my outlet. I don't know. There's something about it where it's just like
Mm.
we're gonna feel sad, and that's okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. You're trying to get in touch with your feelings. I'm trying to ignore my feelings. Great.
Well, I think this is a great segue into our topic today for our podcast. We're going to be talking about Inside Out and Inside Out 2. It's one of my favorite movies as a therapist.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, for a lot of therapists, especially a lot of therapists who are working with children and adolescents, this is like their favorite movie too. Because I remember with the first one, and even with the second one, all of again the child and adolescent girlies, I saw them like with so many different like uh, social media posts, so many like think pieces, thought pieces about Inside Out, and what would our mental health podcast be if we also didn't jump on this bandwagon? So,
Yeah. And actually, I have a whole lot of my adult clients talking with me about Inside Out too. And I think it's because it's like, they're like, finally, there's something that has described what I've gone through my entire life. And I think it's really helped even them understand like what's going on for them. Um, I think it's more in like a retrospective kind of way, though. It's not
mhm.
quite, this is what I'm going through now, and I totally relate. It's like, oh man, that really explains why I was the way that I was, like in high school or like middle school or something like that.
Yeah. And even though the main character, Riley, who, especially in Inside Out 2, is a 13-year-old girl, I still do think with adults, it can still be really helpful for even them now. Like, yes, definitely, like thinking back and reflecting, I think that's so important in mental health. But I think even just talking about the emotions and then how the emotions come together is still important for anyone in any age range. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of even some adults really know how to express themselves in a healthy way emotionally, or even to be able to express what they're feeling. So
Mm-hmm.
um, it's always funny because I feel like animation has this stereotype or stigma of being like for kids, and Disney as well. But at least for me growing up, Disney, and even watching it as a child and even watching it now, I always feel like Disney has something for everyone. Even though obviously it's marketed towards kids, I feel like they always try to incorporate things for both the kids who are watching it and then also for the adults. And, not talking about some of Disney's questionable politics, just talking about the movies. I think that's what makes Disney so great, and that is what makes Disney such a powerhouse in terms of animation, or so synonymous in terms of animation and like family movies and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. And I think also, like, speaking to giving language to adults about like emotions, feelings, and experiences. Like, I come from so I'm Asian American, and I come from a culture where a lot of the feelings that are expressed are things like anger. And so, like, growing up, it would be hard for me to actually talk about what my emotional experience was because I just didn't have the language for it. It wasn't something that my parents taught me, and the range of like emotions that were expressed by my family a lot of time was like anger. Like, even if it's like my parents are trying to show me love, they're like, "Oh, did you eat dinner yet?" And like in an angry voice, and I'm just like, "I ate dinner. It's fine." Like, why are you mad at me? But
Hmm.
they're like, "We're not mad at you. We're just trying to make sure you're fed." And like, I
Hmm.
understand now as an adult, like that's an expression of love. But back then, when I was a child, I was like, "Why are my parents just angry all the time? Like, are people just angry all the time? This is the only emotion I know."
Hmm. Yeah. Thinking back to like my own childhood too, as a Black American, African American person in this country, I think so. I'm a Black woman, and there's a angry Black woman stereotype, and especially growing up, even if it was like legitimate, even if it was understandable, I always felt like if I wasn't happy, if I wasn't at least neutral or calm, then people would like slap on, oh, she's angry. And I think for me, it was really hard because like when so many people are saying like, oh, you're angry, then you start to think like, oh, what I'm feeling is anger. When, with some own self-reflection, thankfully with support of like my own family and like community and also with therapy. You know, therapists have their own therapists. I realized like one, my anger is valid, but also not everything that is coming off as anti-happy, opposite of whatever is anger. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's frustration, and sometimes, depending on cultural and societal expectations, and also just like how you grow up or navigate those things, what looks like anger for one person can actually be anxiety for another person. And, you know, there was a study that came out recently, like a few years ago, that Black women, what it looks like anger for a lot of people, especially a lot of people outside of the Black community, but even people within the Black community, is actually anxiety, it's actually depression. And yeah, it's just been really interesting having those thoughts, even from like a young age when I couldn't really put those thoughts into words. But now being like a mental health professional and like being able to like understand those things, like just thinking and reflecting back on like my own emotions, like you were saying, and how culture plays a role, how society plays a role, and yeah, like emotions are very tricky.
Mm-hmm. And it's complicated. I think that's why movies like Inside Out are so great because I think from like an education standpoint, we could read about it, we could, talk to other people about it, but I think there's something about watching it in a movie and seeing the visuals that really help make it all connect. And I think that's something that I really
Mm-hmm.
appreciated from Inside Out. And so for our listeners who I guess have never seen Inside Out, basically it takes place mainly in the brain of this. In Inside Out, she was a child, but in Inside Out 2, she's an adolescent. So Riley's our main character, and we watch the movie happening like within her brain, and it splits up her brain into like these different emotions. And then there's this control console, and whatever Riley's going through in life, what her behavior is dictated by what emotion is in control of the console at that moment. And so it kind of gives us an idea of like maybe how our brain works a little bit. Like how can our behaviors be impacted by our emotions? And we even see like there's a collaborative effort that happens within the emotions. They're not always just like fighting for the control panel, although it does happen. But a lot of times they'll kind of talk
Mm-hmm.
about, be like, oh my gosh, this situation happened. What do we do? How do we respond? And then we'll see like an emotion take over. It's like, well, we're gonna do this now.
Yeah, and so like in the first movie, we have our main emotions are joy, sadness, fear, anger, and disgust. And I think in the first movie, we really see a lot of how emotions impact our behavior and how, you know, no matter what emotion that we have. And my favorite emotion to focus on, again, because, you know, the stigma with Black women is anger because it's like, a lot of people think of anger as negative, bad emotion, something that you should like squash down, but it's not necessarily that. Anger can actually be really good to have, and it can be really helpful. I've been thinking a lot about like the what these two different movies teach us, and like the first one is like how our emotions can sometimes impact our behavior, and like there's other things as well. But I feel also with Inside Out 2, where again, as Natalie said, Riley is an adolescent. She's 13. She's about to go into her first year of high school. So puberty. I feel like Inside Out 2 kind of also puts a focus on thoughts or core beliefs. And I feel like Inside Out 2 not only shows how our emotions impact our behavior, but how sometimes our emotion impacts our thoughts, or how our thoughts impact our emotions, and then that how that impacts our behaviors as well. And that's something that has been really great to work with clients about, to help them understand that, like, yeah, you can feel angry. Like, that's not a bad thing to feel. It's how you choose to move forward with that anger, how you choose to behave with that anger. Are you going to go and start a fight when that's not something that you should do, or are you going to find other ways or healthier ways to channel that anger instead?
Mm-hmm. And my favorite character is Sadness. I think there's a charm with Sadness that I really enjoy, and I think probably also resonates in my own life too, and like how I handle sadness because it's a feeling that's there, and I think that feeling teaches a lot about like our connection with others and things like that. And an Inside Out one, they were trying to figure out like, well, what's Sadness's role here, and they basically didn't let
Mm-hmm.
her touch any of the memories because they were worried about her tainting a memory with sadness. And and I think we can kind of logically think like, oh yeah, we don't want to be sad, like we just want to be happy, we want all the good memories. But I think there's something about sadness touching those memories that's really important in our lives too, where it's like, yeah, it's okay to be sad about something that happened, right? That's how we feel connected to an experience. It gives us a sense of like connection with other people, and how even
Mm-hmm.
empathizing with other people. I think it takes a lot of being comfortable in our own sadness to empathize with other people. And so I think like that's such a great emotion that I think a lot of times we try to push
Mm-hmm.
away because it just feels so uncomfortable.
Yeah, I work a lot with really younger kids, so kids around the age of 3 to 6 sometimes, and with a specific therapy type that I do, PCIT, parent-child interaction therapy for that age range. You have to incorporate the parents or the guardians into that therapy style. And one thing that always comes up because we talk about emotions a lot is I don't want him to be sad, or I don't want her to be sad, or I don't want my child to be sad, you know. And the thing that I had to teach them is like, sadness is okay. Like the purpose of me as a counselor, the purpose of you as a parent is not to protect your child from sadness, because as you said, like sadness can help with empathy and all these other things, but it can also help us like understand like what we like, what we don't like, what we think is important. And if we take out sadness, then we're taking out a lot of really important things, and that can help us later in life or help us with our relationships and stuff. So yeah, I we could definitely talk all day about Inside Out and the importance of sadness, just that one emotion. And I mean also with the other emotions as well, the importance of those as well.
Right. And I guess I was trying to think of like what were everybody else's functions too, and I'm trying to recall like Joy. I think is an obvious one, where we want Joy's job is to make us feel happy, to really enjoy the moments that we're in and be present, and Fear is basically I guess somebody that keeps us like on our toes about possible danger. Right. Fear is trying to protect us. Fear is trying to make sure that we're not going to be harmed in any way. And I think Disgust, her job was making sure like Riley doesn't get poisoned or something. I don't remember exactly what her job is, but I think it's a feeling of being repulsed by something because that could also potentially be dangerous and things like that. I don't know if you had a clear idea of what Disgust's job was, but I really enjoyed her as an emotion. I am a little unclear about what her job is sometimes.
So I actually pulled it up while you're talking, and this one resource. Let me make sure because it's always important to cite your resources. John Negroni did a thing, and they said that Disgust is highly opinionated, extremely honest, and prevents Riley from getting poisoned, both physically and socially. She keeps a careful eye on the people, places, and things that Riley comes in contact with, whether that's broccoli or last year's fashion trend. Disgust always has the best of intentions and refuses to lower her standards. I'm thinking about like so many clients or just like people in my life who they're just like, oh, I don't really like this, but I'm just going to keep doing this, or I'm going to, in the sense of broccoli, I'm going to keep eating broccoli. I'm like, if you don't like eating broccoli, then don't eat broccoli. Like, and I think, what's now that I'm thinking more about Disgust as like a character, I think, she, one, sets boundaries for Riley, and also, um, as this was saying, like kind of sets standards. Like you don't have to lower your standards, and I think that's something that we should all like take into consideration, like what are ways that we're lowering our standards when we shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually think about that with a lot of the emotions too. Like I do also think like when we talk about anger, I think that's also a boundary setting emotion because anger tells us
Hmm.
something about being hurt or something that doesn't feel right for us. Like it creates like
Hmm.
frustration and irritation and things like that. And so like you don't have to sit with like just being upset all the time, right? I've also had people tell me, clients tell me, like, oh, I don't really like this friend. They make me mad all the time. But, I'm just going to keep trying to be their friend and stuff like that. But then I'm just like, but why?
Hmm.
Why do you want to be friends with somebody who chronically makes you angry? And I think, like,
Hmm.
that anger tells us about, like, boundary setting, right? It's not about ending the friendship because you're angry all the time. It might be saying, like, hey, it's really hurtful or upsetting when you say this thing to me, and if you continue talking to me like that, I may not be as close to you as you want to be, or we may not hang out anymore because of that, right? And so
Hmm.
like anger also like sets boundaries that make you feel safe because it's somebody
Hmm.
has hurt you and you don't want that to continue.
Yeah, and I think sometimes anger can be part of passion as well, in terms of, as you were saying, kind of fear, or not fear, fairness, and just thinking about social justice. So many advocacy movements where people are just like, "Why are you so angry? Like, why can't you be nicer while advocating for this thing?" And just like, that anger has its place in social justice. Anger has its place in advocacy. Now, again, it all comes down to like how you. And I'm saying this in a way, and I'm trying to say this in a way where I'm not trying to police people who advocate, because I do think that there are some situations where you do need to escalate protests in hopefully non-physically harmful way for protest, if that makes sense. But also, like, that's part of how you know that something's important. That's how you know that something is worth fighting for, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And something I always tell my clients is like your feelings, your emotions are always valid, and you are still responsible for what you do with it. Right? Just because you're angry doesn't justify you like breaking a law or like harming somebody in a way that is going to be, permanent or life threatening, you're still responsible for what you do with your emotions. And so, like, perhaps what we're advocating for is like, yeah, use your emotions, set boundaries with it, but also be responsible with it too, because we're not trying to harm people while we're expressing ourselves or like allowing people to see what we're feeling.
Hmm. Exactly. So, yeah, those are the emotions for Inside Out, the first movie. The emotions for Inside Out 2, we still have the same. We still have joy, sadness, fear, anger, and disgust, and we start seeing them working together at the beginning of the movie, like, spoilers, really well. I guess we should have said that.
Oh yeah,
Spoilers,
spoiler
we might be
alert.
talking about some things. Uh, so, yeah, we still have the same characters that we have in Inside Out 1. Again, like I said, Riley is now 13, so puberty has also hit. So with puberty comes along a new batch of emotions to join our original crew, and these include anxiety, envy, embarrassment, and ennui.
And can we also take a moment to appreciate how they introduced puberty into Riley's life? Because it was just literally a normal day after a normal day of living life as Riley, and the our original emotions go to bed, and then all of a sudden there's like a wrecking ball that goes through the entire headquarters and destroys everything, rips up their console, and everyone's just confused about what
It's
happens.
still, yeah, and it's like under construction. It's like still a hot mess. Like nothing is new, nothing is fixed. It's like yeah, and I think it's such a perfect like visual picture of puberty, because oftentimes we think of puberty as this like transitional phase from like childhood to adulthood, and like nothing is set in stone yet. So like even though if I was living in that environment, I would like go bonkers. It's such a great visual picture of like this is a person who is not fully developed. This is a person who has not fully figured out who they are.
And there's some grace in that too, because it's not like it literally happened overnight. And it was an in progress construction. And I think a lot of times like we get so frustrated. I think like as adults we get frustrated at our adolescent selves when we reflect back, but I think also like adolescents going through puberty, they get frustrated with themselves like, "Oh, why can't I just like figure this out? Why can't I just like get all my emotions in order so that I can like live life again?" But it's literally under construction, and it's under construction for so long, and in the meantime it's like we're just trying our best to like deal with it and cope with it.
Yeah, and that's what they're feeling inside. There's also like physical changes as well. That's like, oh my gosh, what's happening?
And I think there's good and bad in being a teenager. I think I learned a lot about myself. I think that was the most free I've ever been with all my emotions because it literally spilled out of me. um, but it was also a tough time because all the emotions spilled out of me, and I'm sure that's what Riley was feeling.
What's that phrase? I was cringe, but I was free. So yeah, so with these new emotions, obviously our old or emotions that we were originally interested in Inside Out one, as you said, they just got used to working together. Now they have these new emotions. And if Inside Out one, my favorite emotion was anger, and Inside Out two, my favorite emotion definitely was a tie between anxiety and ennui.
And I think you might have to explain a little bit about ennui because I also had to look that up. So ennui is a French word that describes both, what was it, both boredom and
And
tired.
tiredness.
Yeah, tiredness and boredom, which I think is a great description sometimes of like the adolescent experience. So I think this was a great character that they introduced because I think a lot of times like I think that's what adults get frustrated with adolescents about when like ennui comes out and it's like, oh, I'm bored, there's nothing to do, and parents are like, there's literally
Mhm.
everything you could do in the world, and then they're like, oh, but I'm tired, I don't want to go out and do anything.
Yeah, I definitely remember being tired about everything. And it makes sense. It's like, again, you're on the emotional, cognitive level, you're trying to both consciously and unconsciously figure out who you are. And then physically, there's a lot of energy going to like everything changing as well. So Ennui, I they were just a really cool character. But if I'm being really honest, anxiety is probably the character that I resonate with. One, not only as a teenager, thinking looking back at it, but even now as an adult. I was just saying earlier that like I have a lot of anxiety about the start of the school year, and it's not necessarily like there's anything new or different happening. It's just transitions are hard sometimes. I tell my parents who I'm working with their like 3 to 6 year olds that like, yeah, transitioning to sleep time is hard. That's why we need to have set schedules and set routines. And the same thing can be true even as adults. There's definitely a lot of research out there that shows that like, our bodies remember certain times, certain places, and even when we're not consciously thinking about things, our bodies are like, oh, this thing that caused a lot of anxiety for me is it's about time for that, even whether or not that same thing is still happening. I guess as a professor, that same thing is still happening, just a different role, but I still feel a lot of anxiety around the start of the school year.
Mm-hmm.
and but again, like anxiety, it could be very easy for me to say like anxiety is this bad emotion, this emotion that's causing me so much issues. But anxiety, as we see in Inside Out 2, has its purpose, has its place, and it's definitely important, just like any of the other emotions. And similarly to sadness, as we saw in Inside Out, sadness has its purpose, and anxiety has its purpose as well.
Mm-hmm. And I believe in Inside Out too, they talk about how anxiety, their job is to plan for the future, which is a very reasonable thing. We all want to plan for the future. We all want to know what's going on. But I think also the problem that we encounter with like planning for the future is that there's also lots of variables that's out of our control. And so sometimes it feels like we saw in the movie, like anxiety could be an overdrive, trying to control for all the uncontrollable factors while planning for the future. And I think that's what we find so distressing when like anxiety is just kind of pushed into overdrive so that we could plan, you know, for the future in a way that's more solid. And the reality is that like
Mhm.
sometimes the future isn't solid, and we have to figure out how do we be okay with that? How do we slow down the anxiety? Because we don't want it to end up taking over our lives, right? And being so caught up in
Mhm.
trying to control something that we can't actually control.
Yeah, and one thing that I know that both of us talk a lot about with our clients, and I even talk a lot about this with my students, especially with their, sometimes own anxiety around seeing clients for the first time, or just being in grad school, is that we can only control what we can control. Like we can only control how we respond to things. We can control what we say. We can't control what other people say. But kind of having that moment with our anxiety where we're like, yes, these things could happen, but also good things could happen as well. And at least what can I do to at least make sure that I'm putting myself in the best place? So, like for myself, again, with this anxiety around the start of the school year, what can I do to make sure that at least that things are going well as much as possible, as much as realistically possible, so I can make sure that after we finish recording, I work on my syllabi and not keep putting them off. And I know that that will, once those are done, that will put me in a better mind space. And that's all I can really do at this point. I can't control my students. I can't control how many students I have in each class. It's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I can't control anyone or anything else other than myself.
Right. And I think anxiety does have like an important role too. Sometimes anxiety does have a job to do. Like you're talking about, Zori, like the anxiety is the one that tells us like, okay, we gotta plan the syllabus. We gotta make sure we have everything we need for the school year to start. We gotta make sure we know what time our classes are so we can get there on time. And that's like anxiety's job. Anxiety is getting us to places and making sure we do things. And then there are moments
Hmm.
where anxiety doesn't have a job, even though anxiety is still going to feel a certain way because the future is always uncertain. Sometimes anxiety just needs to relax. And we see that, like, again, like, spoiler alert, at the end of the movie, we see, like, Joy just, like, putting anxiety into, like, a comfy chair, putting on the massage setting, giving anxiety something.
Having anxiety,
Yeah, some
anxiety.
anxiety. I love that. Just like helping anxiety relax because it's like, okay, anxiety, we value you as a player here, but right now you just need to relax. You don't have a job at this moment.
Yeah, and that like that one part, that one scene, I was like, I thought it was so cool because I think a lot of times also there are people who, as you said, their anxiety is always running. And I feel sometimes when you're a person who is able to manage your anxiety and you're seeing someone whose anxiety is always like in control, always like overworking itself, you're just like, you just need to calm down. You just need to be chill or whatever. And sometimes that's not helpful. But I think, again, in like a very simplified way, obviously for this movie, I think when you really think about it, it's showing that anxiety needs to be in a safe, comfortable space for it to relax, for it to chill out, for it to like step back. And I think that's something that we need to think about for ourselves and for um, friends, family, loved ones who are dealing with anxiety. That like, okay, how is the environment that they're in? How are we contributing to this anxiety? And instead of just being like, you just need to chill out, it's not going to happen. Like, you're overthinking, you're over worrying. Like, how can we make sure that those individuals, and especially for you and I, Natalie, and other mental health professionals, how can we make sure that our clients with anxieties feel heard, feel understood, and not just like we're just trying to shut them down, but like feel safe and comfortable with us?
Right. And sometimes it involves like a timeout space. Like in Inside Out 2, Riley had her first panic attack while she was playing hockey. And it resulted in her getting a penalty and she had to be in like the timeout box. And that's when we saw like what was going on in her head was that anxiety was just like running around the controls trying to figure out like how do I control for this? How do I still like look cool and score the winning goals, be impressive, all these things. It was all about like how do I make this so I turn out to look like the best. And we just can't control that in the moment because right now in this moment, Riley is sitting in a timeout box so that she can cool down. And I think this is where it was nice to see um, what was happening her on the outside and what was it looking like on the inside. Like we saw anxiety running around the controls in this tornado where you almost couldn't see anxiety because it was running around so fast. And then we
Hmm.
saw Riley on the outside in that timeout box where she's like holding onto herself. She's hyperventilating a little bit. She's tapping her leg in an anxious way. And I think that's like a perfect description of like what's happening for people on the inside and outside when we have like an anxiety attack or a panic attack. And
Hmm.
her friends watched her and was trying to figure out like how do we help her. They come and they try to calm her down, but she really needed to be in like a space to reduce like all the stimuli that was happening, and then also her own collective emotions, helping her to just bring anxiety away from the control panel and just be able to let some other emotions take over so that we could respond to the situation appropriately.
Hmm. Yeah, and that was all happening inside, and we also saw how her friends were navigating that as well. And it doesn't have to be anything showy. You don't necessarily have to be a mental health professional to help someone who's having a panic attack like that. So yeah, it was just really cool to see that. So yeah, I feel like anxiety was definitely like one of the emotions that I resonated with a lot. But I also want to talk, if that's okay with you, Natalie, talk about some of the other emotions as well, because I think they are really cool. And um, honestly, if anxiety is an emotion that, again, we often is stereotyped as this negative emotion, I feel like things like envy, embarrassment, and ennui can also be viewed as that way as well. And maybe we can talk about how they also have their important role and protective role for us as well.
Yeah, do you happen to know what their roles are?
In terms of just like characters in the movie, my second favorite new character is Embarrassment. He's just so cute and adorable, and also like I just felt a lot of secondhand embarrassment for him. So, um, again, embarrassment is like something that people tend to think of as negative. Like it's something that like I'm trying not to say they feel embarrassed about being embarrassed, but like, that's the thing. But I feel like embarrassment has a lot of similarly to like disgust. And I don't know if necessarily it's a great one to one to say that embarrassment and disgust. I mean, all these emotions honestly overlap in a lot of different ways. But I think just as, we think about disgust as like being this thing that's just like, okay, is it good? What is her role? I feel like embarrassment also has this role as well, and part of it I do feel like it is boundaries. Part of it is maybe another thing where it's like you realize what's important to you, what you think may be important. I think embarrassment also comes with the added aspect of being aware of other people because most of the time we're embarrassed because we're embarrassed of like how other people are viewing us, right? So I feel, especially when we're thinking about teenagers, but it's anyone in general, that like added thought about like, what does this person think about me, and how am I coming off to them? And again, sometimes embarrassment can be this like, don't perceive me thing, but I also like to think that embarrassment can show, who I really admire, who I really care about. Like, though I know that especially now as an adult, like the people who I like call friends, I feel like yeah, I may do something that's like mildly embarrassing, but like for the most part, like I feel that feeling, but I know like oh, Natalie doesn't care. Like she's probably like okay,
Mm-hmm.
moving on. Versus other strangers who like yeah, I may be doing something embarrassing, and like yeah, I still feel that embarrassment, but I'm just like okay, but I'm never gonna see this person again, so
Mm-hmm.
yellow.
And I think
Um,
embarrassment's another like connecting emotion, just like sadness was. Like it helps us connect with other people. It helps us empathize again. And I think that's why like embarrassment and sadness I almost feel like they became friends in the movie because I think
mhm.
embarrassment really understood where Sadness was coming from, and that Sadness had Riley's best interest in mind and was just trying to help. And so then Embarrassment gets on board with trying to help Sadness. And so I think they just really understood each other very well. And I think like that is also the function of Embarrassment too. Like I think it helps us understand ourselves, it helps us understand other people, and then like we kind of connect because going back to like boundary setting, it's like, oh man, if that happened to me, I would have been so embarrassed. So then does that make you think about like what do you do? How do you help other people so that
Mhm.
they don't end up getting so embarrassed, or maybe you do something for yourself so that you don't end up in that position again. So again, like I think embarrassment,
Mhm.
another great like connecting emotion with other people.
And it's so funny that like sadness and embarrassment were the two emotions that like seem to like get along. Well, I guess you could also say that fear had uh had feelings or a thing for anxiety as well. Because I remember there's one line where he's like, "I think I can change her." I was like, okay. Uh, but I mean, like when you think about it, like sadness and embarrassment are sometimes those emotions that like people are like, "I wish I could just get rid of." But like you said, they're both emotions that allow us to be empathetic and connect with others. And honestly, sometimes I feel like when I'm embarrassed about things, it's because I'm like, oh no, did I hurt my friend? Or oh no, am I a bad friend or something like that? So like I feel embarrassed because I feel like I did not act in a way that was supportive or helpful for them. So I think, again, like you were saying, that embarrassment can be that thing that allows us to maybe pause and think about what's important to us and or how we want to navigate something moving forward. So yeah, embarrassment is just like super cute. And I think another emotion that I can resonate with, and like all throughout the movie, I was just like, oh my gosh, this poor dude. I feel so bad for him, and also I feel embarrassed.
Yeah. And I think I love the way that they created him. It was so like cuddly too, and it's like I want to give embarrassment a hug, and I think that's also how I feel with other people when I see them embarrassed. It's like, oh, I just want to give you a big hug
Hmm.
and let you know like it's okay.
And I don't know how they come up with some of the designs, but I always feel like their designs are always like spot on, like perfect. So yeah, so that's embarrassment. Then we have envy, which I will admit, when we first see Envy, I was just like speaking of like character design, I was just like, huh, that's not necessarily what I would have thought of for Envy. Like, if anything, I would have thought if you just told me that there was going to be an emotion in Inside Out 2 named Envy, I think I would have thought about a character that was like similar to character design of Disgust,
Mm.
you know? But it was really interesting to see how they portrayed Envy as someone with like these like big eyes, someone who wasn't necessarily like letting people down. And maybe that's maybe where envy and disgust maybe overlap. Maybe that's what I'm thinking about. But like envy, how they portrayed it was just like someone who saw something desirable in someone else. And again, that's not something bad because there could be maybe someone that we look up to and we want to see ourselves in that. Again, thinking about you know for my love, Suga from BTS. You know, I, I guess there is an element when I think about him or any of the other members of BTS or any other character or person, celebrity person who parasocial relationship, where there is an element of envy, but it's not envy like, oh, I hate you or oh, you suck, but it's like an envy like, oh, I wish I had that confidence, that talent, And again, it's not necessarily bad, and sometimes I can be like, oh, maybe that's inspiration that inspires me to try myself.
Yeah. And we have a guest here. This is Loki. This my cat. He just interrupted the podcast, but hopefully not too disruptive. But I was also thinking about like Envy too and the character design because like you said, I did think of it more in like Envy would have been more of a I guess like more of an ugly portrayed character. because sometimes we associate like envy with like ugliness, like you shouldn't envy others, but it's almost like a childlike innocence that envy is portrayed in.
Hmm.
And I think that's a really good way of looking at envy. Like you're talking about like the admiration side of envy. Um, because there is something so innocent about just wanting something. Because I think, it's not always going to be malicious in wanting something. I think that's a natural thing that people desire for. It's like, oh, I would love to like live in a house this big, or I would love to um, have the status that somebody else has. And I think like those things drive inspiration. And so like in that way, like this is how we use envy in a positive way in our lives, where it's like, okay, this becomes like something that I'm dreaming about. This is an aspiration now, and this is how I'm going to move forward with it. And I think we kind of see that in the movie
Hmm.
too, where like Riley admires these girls, and Envy is like staring at them with like these big ol' eyes, like, oh my gosh, this is the coolest thing ever, right? And I think
Hmm.
that's a way that we could also figure out like how do we do that in our own lives, where it's more about admiration and building ourselves up instead of trying to like use envy as a way to like step over people to get what we want, because I think that's a completely different tone.
Hmm. Yeah. So again, it's just like, whoever created these like characters and their character designs, like, and again, like, uh, I, I don't know if we mentioned this in this podcast, but at the end credits of Inside Out 2, and I'm sure in Inside Out, the first one as well, they did have mental health consultants, which is so cool. You know, the fact that they had actual experts um, who came in, they probably talked to, and they also probably contributed to these characters and their character designs and stuff like that. So Envy would not have been looking as cute as she does in Inside Out 2 if I had any say about that. But yeah, and I think that's like kind of the cool thing about Inside Out, both the first one and second one. They kind of portray the characters, at least initially, I feel like in their most positive self, like in their most healthy self. And then obviously there are times where they slip into not so healthy versions of themselves. But I think that's really
Mm.
cool to think about.
Yeah. And, even talking
Uh,
about the slips too, I think a scene that kind of got me tearing up a little bit in Inside Out too was when Joy breaks and she's yelling at all the emotions. Like, you think it's easy for me to always be this happy and this joyful, like it's hard to maintain all this. And I think like that's a piece of reality that like really hit for me too, because I think in a lot of our lives we try to maintain this idea like everything's fine, it's, everything's good, I'm just being my best self and being happy. But if that's not what's actually happening in your life, it's so hard to just like be joyful all the time, and it's so ingenuine.
mhm.
And so I love that moment because it was so real. I think hopefully for a lot of other people that it resonated with them, that like you don't have to be happy all the time, right? The genuine you is going to be experiencing a range of emotions, and it's not always going to be joy. And joy gets tired too of pretending things are fine.
Mhm. Yeah, I that just felt like such a real moment in the movie, you know, especially if you like thinking about it as an emotion, but also just thinking about it as like a person. And I feel like oftentimes we unfortunately water down our friends, our family, people that we know in our life by like, oh, this person is like always a happy person, or oh, this person's always, an anxious person or whatever. And I think unfortunately, sometimes we allow ourselves to just see our other people or even see ourselves as like, oh, I'm always supposed to be happy, or this is always a happy person. And then because of that, we maybe don't check in with ourselves, we don't check in with others. And unfortunately, that's when a lot of like not so great mental health related stuff happens because we aren't checking in with ourselves and with each other. And I thought it was so important to show that even happy people, even people who, you know, are all intents and purposes may always seem like they have things together. They may always like seem like they are always looking at the bright side. They are also going through their own emotional stuff, and we need to support them as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's great that we were able to have a real moment with Riley. I think sometimes with like movies, it's like we try to make it all happy, but I think like it's important for media to also portray like the realness of it too, because then I think it helps make us feel normal. I think that's why we really enjoy
Hmm.
watching movies like this, because it's like, oh, it's so real, and if somebody had created this movie, then in theory another person has thought and felt the same thing that you have felt. And so it helps you to just not feel
Hmm.
so alone, and helps you feel like normal in what you feel, because I think also like what we're trying to help people understand in our profession is that like emotions are normal, it's all there and it's all okay, and we determine what we do with it for good and the bad. You know, we hope that it's for good for you so that you can be in a mentally healthy space, but sometimes it is bad. And sometimes we have to think
Hmm.
about the way that we change ourselves or change the way that we handle the emotion so that it can become healthy. But always just being like typecasted in like this one emotion all the time, I think that gets exhausting and that gets really unhealthy really quickly.
And that kind of, I think, is a nice little transition to ennui, especially thinking about teenagers with ennui, because again, Riley's a 13-year-old. And so, like, ennui, as we said before, is like feelings of like boredom or tiredness. And I think teenagers get so typecasted as like, okay, you're just being lazy or, blah, blah, blah. But again, as we've been talking about, all these feelings, all these emotions have their importance, they have their role. And I think ennui can tell us, like, okay, yeah, this is maybe not something that I'm into anymore. Maybe I need to try something else. I need to do something different. And, thinking again back to being a teenager and puberty and growing up, there's some things that we used to like be really into as like kids, as or even as teenagers now, as adults, that we're not into anymore. And that's okay. That's another moment of realizing what's important to us. That's another moment of potentially realizing what our boundaries are. And again, just as we've been saying, ennui has uh, um, their own role in terms of our emotional well-being.
And I imagine this is when people say like they go through their emo phase. I think I'm just imagining like ennui the whole time, because I think that really captures it. Also, like when you think about like emo people, like we also associate it with like, oh, there's so many emotions. But I think like sometimes it is about like there's a lot of emotions, but we just can't be bothered with it or things like that. It also made me think about how I think ennui and embarrassment like come together when we think back on our lives and we're just like, oh my gosh, that was the cringiest thing I've ever done. Like that's a version of myself I don't want to relive. And so like I think that's another like helpful part too, that it helps us kind of like ennui helps us reflect on who we've been and who we are now, and then compare it side by side. And I think we always need to look at like our own growths as people, because I'm sure like we all look back and we're
Hmm.
like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, that was so embarrassing, you know. And I'm embarrassed about it, but you know, it's a sign of growth, embarrassment, getting through it, changing yourself, to become more of the person you want to be. That's part of your own personal growth, and I think that was the function of ennui to kind of propel Riley into like growing up in puberty. Like these are now the updated versions of who I am, and you know, these are things I'm no longer interested in.
And I think that's so important because, again, from a lifespan perspective, so like a how, at least Western, I should say that, a Western individualistic perspective, it kind of shows like adolescence, teenage years are the years where we start to realize, how am I different from my family? Like, how do I connect to my peers? And we see that also into like the young adult stage, like the college age stage as well, where people are starting to figure out who they are outside of their family of origin, so the family that they grew up with, whether again that's like biological or by choice. And I think ennui has this again own role in that as well, because we see Riley kind of being like bored or uninterested with some of the things that her parents propose to do. And again, it's not necessarily that those are like bad things. And who knows, maybe when Riley is older, and I kind of do hope they have like an Inside Out 3 where she's like maybe college age or like more of an adult, kind of like Toy Story, the never ending Toy Story with Andy. But like, it would be really interesting to see if some of the things that Ennui was like, this is boring or whatever, Riley is like, oh no, this was actually important. I wish I spent more time with this, you
Mm-hmm.
know, because I definitely feel like Ennui, at least for Riley in Inside Out 2 as a teenager, is more of that character that helps her connect with peers
Mm-hmm.
and like friendship and those types of relationships.
Yeah. And I also hope there's going to be another Inside Out so we can follow like Riley through the lifespan. I want to see what happens with nostalgia. And I feel like that's the open door of like the next phase of Riley's life. But I feel like that's so later in her life. I don't know if that's going to come out anytime soon.
I mean, I have nostalgia all the time. I mean, and so we didn't mention this because it was like such a very small character, but there's technically another emotion, nostalgia, that comes in at the beginning of puberty, and someone's like, "Oh no, nostalgia, you're here a few years too early. Come back later." And then I think nostalgia pops up again towards the end as well, just as like comic relief. But yeah, no, I mean, now entering my 30s and, you know, gotta stretch to do some things, gotta actually get some sleep to do some things, gotta, I can't just drink alcohol and expect to pop up like a daisy anymore. So, like, there's definitely some nostalgia that's creeping in now where I'm just like, oh, in my youth.
And that's the part of you that wishes you can go back in time and tell yourself, like, yeah, go get that sleep. Like, don't pull that all nighter. It won't be worth it in the future.
Yeah, but I think there's also that, like, that part of me where, again, if we're thinking about positively and also not so positively perceived, I think the positive of nostalgia is like being able to like remember those good times as well, or at least at the very least be able to see the growth, as you said, of that. So yeah, I do kind of hope we do get to the stage. I mean, I guess when did the first Inside Out came out? Is Riley
Um,
supposed to be a millennial or Gen Z?
oh, I have no
Um,
idea. I want to say Gen Z.
So I don't know. Maybe it's too early yet. But if Gen Z is anything like millennial, the nostalgia is coming soon. So yeah. So we've been talking a lot about the emotions. I also again think it's really important to talk about the core beliefs that Inside
Mm-hmm.
Out 2 brought up.
Yeah, I mean, I love that description because I think, again, core beliefs is something that I try to explain to my clients. Like, I'll try to draw a diagram and try to help them understand, like, what contributes to your core beliefs, how does it affect you, and creating in your sense of self. And then all of a sudden, Inside Out 2 comes and creates, like, this perfect, like, imagery, I think, of what core beliefs look like and how it contributes to your sense of belief. And so in the movie, it kind of visualizes it in the way that like you take the core memory, like a really good memory, and then you bring it down to this place. I don't remember what it was called, but it was almost like this river. um, and so you just put that core memory into the river, and then it creates a strand that moves up um, into some space, and then it creates a shape up in headquarters, which is supposed to be Riley's sense of self. So I think that's such a
Mm-hmm.
great way of describing it because core beliefs are built on memories that are impactful in our lives and then gets integrated in a way that's like woven into our DNA almost. And then it creates this idea of who we are, like it visualizes who we are based off of the memories that were impactful in our lives.
And again, like thinking about this from like a mental health perspective, like those core ideas then can sometimes impact our thoughts or can sometimes impact our emotions, and it kind of creates this like feedback loop of. So, like for example, at the beginning of the movie, Riley, one of her core beliefs was like, "I'm a good friend," and we kind of start to see how that core beliefs like changes. It goes from "I'm a good friend" to like "I'm not a good friend," or "I'm a bad person," or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And we see how that impacts her emotions, how, especially with anxiety, that kind of fuels anxiety's spiral, her anxiety storm, or whatever you want to call it, or panic attack. I guess that's probably the best word to use it. And that kind of also impacted her behavior. She started acting rough in the scrimmage that they were doing. She started acting in a way that wasn't very sportsmanlike. So, yeah, core beliefs are really interesting, and I think as much as an animated movie could do, I think they did it really well in terms of like how these emotions impacted memories and how those memories impact core beliefs and stuff like that. And especially for a teenager where everything just feels like what's going on. Even like for the most well-adjusted teenager, there's always that like sense of doubt that pops up because there's a lot of hormones happening, and I remember watching Inside Out 2 and thinking like, what was my core beliefs as a teenager? And yeah, it was teenage Zori. Anxiety was really very much taking over. Anxiety, depression, maybe embarrassment was taking over a lot. So thinking about like core beliefs and how that impacts people's emotions, but also how they behave, and then that's all happening internally. But how we behave, how we act, how we think, can impact our relationships as well. And we start to see Riley's best childhood friends start to like kind of distance themselves from her, and then we also saw on the flip side that the older high school girls that she was trying to become friends with were kind of like giving her like, what's going on, what's wrong with you, type of thing as well. And it's just so interesting to think about.
And on a grander scale, too, like what this all ripples out to, like it's so important that we have our sense of self and knowing who we are because it also informs like our worldview. And so, I think one of the problems that we saw in the beginning of Inside Out 2 was that Joy was like selectively choosing which memories become core beliefs. And the problem with that is that it doesn't give you a whole view of the world and a whole view of who you are. And so this is something that I really appreciate out of narrative therapy. Because in narrative therapy, the idea is that we connect different impactful points in our lives in different ways to create different narratives. And so, in doing that, there's also points that we don't connect and incorporate into our narrative. And the problem with that is that we don't incorporate all those narratives. We don't have a whole view of what the story is now. And so it changes the way that
Mm-hmm.
you completely see the world because Riley went from believing like, oh, I have such great friends, I'm here to have fun, I'm a silly person, I'm happy all the time. And then when we start incorporating these other memories that are touched by emotions that are a little bit more difficult to sit with, a little bit more uncomfortable, it really challenged her idea of like who she was and how she saw the world because all of a sudden the world wasn't so happy anymore. And there weren't all these great things that she was noticing about her and her characteristics. And so, like, that shakes up your sense of who you are, but at the same time, I think we saw at the end, it was so freeing to be able to live in the space of I am a good friend sometimes. Sometimes I'm going to mess up. Sometimes we're going to be great friends. We're going to do all the right things. And all that is okay. And so that helps us to build kind of a healthier sense of self when we can accept, like, the good parts and the bad parts of us.
I think that's so important because no one's perfect. Unfortunately, we don't know everything about everyone's experience. And just thinking about living in this world where whether even when we try to our best intentions, we might still like offend someone or might still like say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. I think Riley being able to hold both, I don't know, the anxiety, the embarrassment, the envy, and also being able to hold the positive things about herself is so important. It's something that we also need to, that we do a lot with our clients and also with ourselves as well. Even as a mental health professional, even as a professor, I still get things wrong. And I hopefully try to create a space where my students can call me out on that. And even though, yeah, I might feel embarrassment, I might feel anger, I might feel like, oh my gosh, like, let me just ignore this, let me just like move on, like really being able to sit with our feelings is, yeah, it's uncomfortable, but it's so needed, it's so important. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the world who don't do that. And because they don't do that, like you said, their viewpoint on the world gets so small. Sometimes they're not able to relate to other people as well or as deeply as they may be want to do. And not going into like a social justice advocacy soapbox for too long, but I think that's where we see a lot of lack of empathy for things that are going on in the world currently, because people aren't willing to sit in that uncomfortableness in regards to what does that mean about like these thoughts, the ideas, these things that you do, your behavior, and what you choose to do or what you choose not to do, and how and what does that mean about you? Because yeah, as we talked about before, though these emotions are important, there are still some emotions that even for us, when we know that these emotions are important, are needed, if we still kind of like, oh, don't want to deal with this, don't want to deal with sadness. And kind of like how I was saying at the beginning of the episode, like, don't want to watch This Is Us because I don't want to cry. Maybe I need to cry. Maybe that's what I need at this moment. But realizing that we need to get in touch with our feelings, and oftentimes when we're getting in touch with our feelings, it's not always great. But if we're doing it in a safe and supportive environment, it's definitely needed.
And I think it gives us some hope too in being able to incorporate those feelings because I think sometimes we feel like because they're core beliefs, we can't change them. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the thought that we really get stuck in. It's like, well, I've always been thinking this way. I've always viewed myself this way, and so I can't change. But like the reality
Mm-hmm.
of it is that like core beliefs get updated all the time. And like that's what we were seeing with Riley when, we were just dumping all these different memories into like her river. She was able to kind of update her own core beliefs so that it became more accurate to like who she is today. Because I don't want to say that like our core beliefs are wrong, because I think our core beliefs can be correct at a certain point in time in our lives, and then we have to
Mm-hmm.
continue to update it over time as well. And so I think like that's the hopeful thing for us too, because I think that helps us not feel stuck as people, because then that means I get to change, I get to evolve. There's so much more breathing room when we could say that like our core beliefs can change, the way that we view ourselves and the world can change. But like you said, like it involves hard work, right? We have to sit with all the negative emotions that we're so uncomfortable with, and it's really hard. But then also we have to think about like, well, is it going to be worth it? Right, to have this more expanded view of ourselves and the world, and to feel a little bit more comfortable being able to hold all the different kinds of emotion, even though they feel like they may conflict with each other, right? All those feelings feel okay to sit with.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, I feel like we covered a lot in talking about Inside Out too. Anything else you want to talk about, Natalie, in regards to this movie?
Oh man, I think we covered a lot too. I think we covered some of the big points here. Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to hopefully see Riley as an adult sometime and see what that brain is like, see what else we discover. So hopefully in a couple of years we have that
Yeah, see
out.
what emotions.
Yeah.
Yeah, see what different emotions they come up with. That would be really cool. Awesome. Well, folks, I think that's the end of our episode for today. Thanks as always for watching, listening to us, and we hope that we can go on another tangent with you in the next one.
Yeah, I'll see you guys next time.
I'm Zori,
Natalie.
and this is Natalie. Bye.
Bye.